Hello, this is Political Dharma with Alan Zundel, and today I am doing an interview with Dr. Kristen Monroe. She is the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and the founding director of the UCI International Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics and Moral. Trouble reading my own writing. And we're going to be talking about moral courage and particularly political moral courage. And in honor of the occasion, I put on my Mohandas Gandhi t-shirt. I stepped away from my microphone for a minute, but that's my Mohandas Gandhi t-shirt because he and Martin Luther King are two of the figures in politics that I respect most in the modern era, both exemplars of, I think, political moral courage. But a lot of your work is not with famous figures like that. It's more ordinary people and people who are maybe politically active, so different from the ordinary person, more politically active, but not necessarily famous or terribly influential. Let me talk a little bit about your background here and give you a chance to expand upon it if you'd like. You have written multiple books, and I noticed in your bibliography of the book that I read, your most recent publication, going back to 1996, you have a title, The Heart of Altruism, Perceptions of a Common Humanity. And I found that title very intriguing. Since then, you've written more than a dozen books and lots and lots of articles, having been a professor for a long time now. And those books and your research have been winners of multiple awards. So first off, I would like to ask you, is there anything else you'd like the audience to know about yourself? And how did you get into this area of altruism, which is not really at the center of political science as I've known it? And I was a professor of political science myself.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, actually. I was trained as a, as a rational choice person at the University of Chicago. Rational choice theory, as you know, is the theory that argues if you want to understand human behavior, you assume people will operate on their best interests, trying to fulfill that, subject to information and opportunity costs. So you don't go out and drive every car. You kind of figure out which are the safest car, if that's your main criteria, or which is the fastest car, if that's what you care about. And then you look up and you do what is going to be best for your self-interest. And as I finished a book on that, I realized that their altruism doesn't fit. And so it's always interesting to look at the cases that don't fit into a theory, because that'll tell you something about the theory itself. So I started looking at altruists, and I in the Heart of Altruism, which I really enjoyed writing, totally different kind of enterprise for me. I did a lot of interviews with people who were altruists. I used entrepreneurs as the kind of baseline data, people who do try to operate on the basis of their self-interest. And then I looked at philanthropists who give away a lot of their money, but not all of it. And then Carnegie Hero Commission recipients. These are people who are not, they're ordinary people like you and me, who do something heroic. They jump in a lake to save somebody. They may go into a burning building to pull somebody out. They do something unusual. And then the last group I looked at were people who rescued Jews and worked in the resistance during World War II. And they were the most extreme people because it went on for years in many cases. And they knew that not only would they be killed if they were caught, but other people in their family would be killed too. And so I had to throw out everything I learned. Nothing seemed to explain these people. And so I came up with my own theory, which is that how we see ourselves in relation to others will both set and delineate the range of choice options we find available, not just morally, but cognitively. So that altruists, when I interviewed people who were rescued Jews, for example, kept saying things like, but what else could I do? They were human beings like you and me. And when I interviewed some bystanders, which I did for another book then, Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, bystanders said something which is very similar. They said, but what could I do? I was one person alone against the Nazis. So in both cases, there's no choice. The people feel they have to do something. but very different actions because of how they see themselves. So it's very interesting. Philosophers use the concept of agency, which is how you see yourself as what is it that causes change. And some people see themselves as having the ability to affect things and other people don't. And I saw this in my own family. My father was a judge, was killed in a car accident. And there was someone that we knew whose children had been taken away from him illegally. The woman had just fled the country. And people were very upset about what was going on. And everybody was, oh, this is horrible. And my mother, who was not a lawyer, was sitting at the dinner table one night. And she said, if your father were alive, he'd do something. So I'm going to do something. So she went to the phone and she found they knew where this man was. She called the sheriff in that area and said, can you help get these man's children back? So the idea that you can affect change in the world is a very important one, and how you see yourself. If you see yourself as someone who's very weak and ineffectual, then you're not going to do anything to try to help people. But if you see yourself as someone who has the ability to make a change, to have some little tiny impact, then you'll do something. And so the book that we wrote on Donald Trump, which is people who stood up to Donald Trump, I did with 14 students. They wanted very much to continue working with me. They enjoyed the research we'd done together, and they wanted to do more research. So we set out and I said, well, why don't we try to interview a few of these Republicans who are standing up to Trump? Because that's a hard thing to do. And we did the interviews 2 years ago, remember? So it was a lot more difficult then than it is now even. And some of the kids, one of the kids found out, got the address for Rick Wilson, who set up the Lincoln Project, and we got an interview with Wilson because of this kid. So one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to show these kids that you can always have something. You can, even if you're a high school or a college student, you still can have an impact in the world. And so that was one of the things that I thought was important about altruism. It shows you that there are limitations to self-interest. We don't always operate on the basis of our self-interest. And sometimes we change the world because of that, as the people who rescued Jews did. They saved a lot of people.
Well, when I think back on my own time in political science, which is going back a ways, I left academia 20 years ago or so, but rational choice theory was still very prominent. And when you would discuss it from a theoretical standpoint and say, well, what about these people who do altruistic things? It would either be explained away on the basis that they really had a self-interest somehow in there, or they're exceptions, they're rare exceptions to the rule that people generally pursue their own self-interest as they perceive it. But also, that I'm finding more and more, and you're confirming this in your research, I think, that this is not exceptions to the rule, that most people have a sense of identity which compels them to take what they see as the most moral action, despite how it may affect their personal fortunes or their own family, maybe.
Well, I think you're right. And when I started doing this work, I got beaten up at conferences. Oh, Kristen, it's just self-interest in another form. They're doing it because they want attention. And they're being nice to other people because they think they'll get something back. And it was easier to do that in general, theoretical terms. But when I had the interviews, especially the interviews with the people who rescued Jews, they were so powerful. Just hearing the stories that these people had to tell, that it kind of grabbed people by the throat and said, listen, you got to look at a different way of seeing things. And that's one of the things that I thought is very powerful about narrative interviews. You see many more details than you do with a survey or with any kind of other type of data. And so that is why I think the work had the impact that it did. The stories were just so vibrant. When I did The Hand of Compassion, one of the reviewers for the book said it was a man named Bob Jervis, who was a top person in the field, now unfortunately dead. And he said, I just thought I could skim the stories, but I couldn't put them down. Every one of them was interesting.
It is always compelling to read somebody's story of how they made decisions or what led them to a certain point. So let's get back to the book that you have recently published, and the title is Politics, Principle, and Standing Up to Donald Trump: Moral Courage in the Republican Party. This is published this year. Is it out yet, or is it?
It's out. It's just out. Yeah.
Published 2024 by the Ethics International Press in the United Kingdom, and you have 13 student co-author researchers. And you said a little bit about how this came together. How did it come together? What was the genesis for this? It was from a class, I think I remember you saying.
Not
And
from the class. I run a summer program every summer at the Ethics Center where we have, there are a lot of students who want to get involved in research. They don't care about getting paid. They don't want credit for it. And so people started coming to me, gosh, 20 years ago. And I would say, well, I can get you involved in some research. And usually if they do a good job, I'll put their name on the article or something. So that helps them with, graduate school or college admissions and things. But we now have, when COVID hit, we had 40 people in 2019. And then when COVID came, I thought, well, that's the end of the program. But I thought, well, we could go online. And we now have over 500 people all over the world. People get up in China and India at 3 o'clock in the morning to do the modules. It's a 4-month summer module. I don't take any money for it. You don't have to pay anything for it. We do have so many applicants now, we have to have a small processing fee, but we have people all the world. We have an Israeli scholar who's a Holocaust survivor who works with a Palestinian Israeli. He did a wonderful module on perspective taking and how seeing things from, you have to look at things from the other side, from all the ways to put yourself in other people's shoes to see what they think about things. And so I usually do 1 or 2 modules. Last year we had 17 people, graduate students and faculty doing it. And the kids are very enthusiastic and they want to keep working. And I keep saying, no, you got to do your regular schoolwork. And they say, no, they want to do this. So we worked all year. We'd meet once every 2 weeks and I'd show them how you do research, how you analyze an interview. And so they learn a lot from it. And we have some people now, they're doing some studies on immigrants because so many of the students I work with at Irvine are immigrant students. They're first generation college students sometimes. Parents don't always speak English well. So I said, do an interview with a grandparent or a parent who came here. And so some of them are doing interviews on immigrants because it's interesting. Trump has this idea that he puts out that immigrants are rapists, they're from insane asylums, they're from, prisons, and they're coming to, eat our dogs and cats and rape our wives and mothers and things. And if you look at who immigrants really are, not at all. One girl, actually, you'll find this interesting. Her grandfather worked with Gandhi. He was in prison with Gandhi at the early stages, and that was her other grandfather. He's not an immigrant, but I said, get that interview down because you want to have it. It's historically significant, sort of thing. So we have a lot of wonderful students that work there, and it's just such a pleasure to work with them. You really can't say no. So it's a good program, and I enjoy it a lot. And they wanted to do this book.
Thank you. Let
Me.
me read a couple of sentences from the preface. I think these are the very first sentences in the book. This book is not intended to bash Donald Trump, although it ends by being extremely critical of both Trump and his policies. It is a scholarly attempt to analyze the Republican politicians who have stood up to Trump and to understand what drove their moral courage. So this is a study of Republicans who at some point decided they had to oppose Trump. And I remember the examples had to do with sometimes early in Trump's administration, sometimes later with the January 6th incident. So the elephant in the room right now is there's an awful lot of people who are thinking of voting for Trump this time around.
Right.
And half the population, the voting population, it appears. So if you wanted to try to pitch this book to a Trump voter, not necessarily a hardcore Trump supporter, but someone who leans towards Republicans and doesn't see the alternative as acceptable, how would you pitch it to them? What would you say that they could get out of this book that would be applicable, given their position of thinking Trump is an acceptable choice?
Well, it's interesting because all of these people that we interviewed, and some people we interviewed, it was difficult to get interviews because people were afraid or people were in a position of authority. We tried to get Brad Raffensperger, for example, and he's still involved and he didn't want to get involved in any political things. But we did, so we looked at writings, interviews, things by John McCain, Mitt Romney, Jeff Flake, three senators who had broken early with Trump. And then we did interviews with Miles Taylor. We did an interview, we analyzed Miles Taylor, who was the person who wrote the op-ed piece that by Anonymous that said there are grown-ups in the room and we will make sure Trump doesn't go crazy and do terrible things. And then we ended up with Liz Cheney and Raps and Adam Kinzinger, in addition to Scaramucci and Rick Wilson, whom we interviewed. And if you look at what their policies, they vote, a lot of these people, very closely with Trump, some of them over 90% of the time in general policies. What caused them to break were three reasons. First, conservative values. They felt that Trump was not actually a conservative, that he was hurting the conservative cause to which most of them had been dedicated their whole life. The idea of small government, the idea of government that helps business, that is certain, kind of Main Street integrity, rock core values. I think the salt of the earth type people in the Middle West, working class people, they felt Trump wasn't really helping those people in terms of policies, that he had picked up on their anger and feeling of being grieved, being left behind. And he was milking that and encouraging us to think in an us versus them way. And they thought that conservatives do not actually do that, that conservatives try to bring people together, that there's an idea that you can serve what's good in the country. So they felt he was actually hurting the conservative cause. Second thing they felt was that he didn't really understand the basic rules of the game for how politics is played in this country, that you have laws that you have to follow, that you have certain ethical codes that you have to abide by. You have to try to be objective in certain situations. So the COVID was one example that they felt Trump just totally blew it with COVID. He comes up with bizarre things that if you drink bleach, you won't die of COVID, which actually is true. You won't die of COVID if you drink bleach because you'll be dead because you drank the bleach. And this is very harmful. And that his tax policies were helping the billionaires. They weren't really helping the middle class. And they felt that when he, especially after January 6th, they felt that this was a violation of the basic rules of the game, that you do not have, if you're vice president of the United States, you have certain obligations, you have certain responsibilities that come from your oath of office. And the oath of office was very important to all of these people. And so they felt that Trump, when he called Brad Raffensperger in that famous conversation where it's recorded, we have the actual talk of it. And he's trying to pressure Raffensperger to find the votes that he needs in Georgia. And it's not a business negotiation to these people. They took an oath of office to count the votes fairly. And that is something they felt Trump did not recognize and respect the democratic norms and rules. And then the third thing was a very basic thing that Miles Taylor captured, for example, when he said that when they had the immigration policy, Trump felt if you're very harsh on immigration, people will learn not to do it. And so we're going to separate children. We're going to put them, who cares if they're put in cages? And when they convinced Trump to stop doing that, Miles Taylor said that Trump kept coming into the office every day saying, we need to do this again. We have to be harsh with these people. And Taylor said, this is not who we are as Republicans. It was a basic visceral identity feeling that this is not who we are as Americans. This is not how Americans treat people. We don't put children, take them away from their parents and put them in cages just because they are immigrants. That's not something you should do. And so it was really three. If I were talking with a Republican, I would say, you need to listen to the Republican royalty, people like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, people like, John McCain and Jeff Flake. These are seriously conservative Republican people who've been Republicans their whole lives, and they feel that Trump is unfit to rule. And you should think about what he's going to actually do, the conservative cause that you care about, what he's going to do to the American democratic norms, and what he's going to do to the basic civic culture that we live in. And those are the three things that I think people would think about a little bit. Like, are we really somebody that wants a president who behaves this badly, who shoves aside other diplomats, who talks about shithole countries. I mean, what kind of a vocabulary is this to use? Do you want him inventing things out of thin air, like the story about the immigrants in Haiti coming to Ohio and eating pets? He knows it's not true, and he still continues to do it. And it does a lot of harm. You know, there've been bomb threats. There are a lot of people who've gotten into trouble because of the lies that Trump is close.
So even though the book focuses on the criticisms of Donald Trump, in a sense, it really is about people who Republicans could identify with and sympathize with,
Right.
that they hold the same type of values. And
Right.
it's not in any way presenting them in a bad light. It's simply saying, well, how did you come to this point? Given, and I think an important element of this that we haven't emphasized is that they did this at considerable professional and personal cost. I was struck by the number of times they mentioned death threats to themselves and their families as well.
Yeah, Scaramucci and Rick Wilson told me they still have, they pay thousands of dollars every month for personal security because Trump has come after their kids. He's criticized their children. Oh, he did it with the judge who was involved in the case, one of the cases in New York. He gave, the judge's daughter's name. There have been small office holders in places like Georgia where they've put their names and addresses up on the web, and people have gone by their houses and have tried to attack them or have, terrorized them in minor ways. And that's not something you should do. I mean, I grew up in a political family. My dad was a judge and my grandfather was a state senator for years. And I remember my dad taking me over to the courthouse the nights they had elections, and they would see the boxes where the votes came in. And the people that were counting, recorders who were recording these things, they were nobody special. They weren't people who had a great deal of power. They didn't get paid a lot for their job. They were doing it because they cared about the United States, and they thought that it was important that you have votes that are fairly counted. And this is something Trump has attacked these people. And there's a lot of evidence that he's planning on doing it again. I don't know if you noticed yesterday, some of the former Republican governors, people like Jeb Bush, have come out and said the people who are state office holders who are counting and certifying the ballots need to be sure that they have a good system, because there's a lot of efforts to discredit them. And all the evidence I've seen from the 2020 election is it was one of the fairest elections we've had. There were a lot of concerns to make sure people got their vote counted. They got it counted in time. And yet Trump continues to say it was an unfair election, that it was stolen. And he encourages people to go out and do things where there were people actually killed in the January 6th insurrection. It was a terrible thing, and we forget about it a little bit. And there's all the evidence I've seen is he's going to do it again. So one of the reasons we went with this Ethics International Press was that they promised to bring the book out very quickly. So it is out before the election. And I do hope people will read it, not because we want any royalties, but you don't get much royalties on academic books, but because we really want people to read what other Republicans have said. These people are people with a great deal of dignity. We have a quote, long quote from John McCain, as he knew he was dying. And he said, "Before I leave, I want my fellow Americans to remember that the most important thing that we have in this country is what unites us, is our common humanity." And I thought that was an extraordinary thing for someone to say, who had wanted very badly to be president, did not get it. And yet during the election, when people attacked, there were a couple times we know when there were public talks where people would say, "Oh, I don't like Obama. He's a Muslim. He's a terrorist." And McCain would say, "No, he's not. He's a very good, decent man." That's the kind of integrity that we need to have in politics, where even if you disagree with someone's politics, you can respect them and understand where they came from a different point of view. So I do have some friends. I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and I have two very dear friends who are Trump supporters. And I didn't attack them. I said in 2016, when they first came out, I said, "What is it you like about Trump? Try to explain it to me." And it was abortion and immigration policy. And at one point I had when I go back to visit this home that I grew up in, we always have a party and have all these women over. They're now in their 70s. And I was sitting at a table and I had my arms, I was standing over one of the women, and she was a Trump supporter. And I don't post on Facebook often, but I did post this one. And I said, see, Hillary supporters can love Trump supporters. And I had so many people write me about that and say that was really important to know that you can still love people and still have affection and good ties with people, even across these political divides. And even after Donald Trump is gone, we need to try to fight against the divisiveness, the us versus them mentality that he has fostered and nurtured in this country, because we're all part of the United States. We're all part of America. We're all part of the common humanity that we live in, which you talk about with the altruism. So that altruist, when you and I see a stranger, an altruist just sees a fellow human being, and we all are fellow human beings. And we need to remember that we have more in common with people than differences. And that's one thing that is terrifying about Trump, that he doesn't see that. It's all us versus them, which is a scary thing in politics.
As I was reading, I kept trying to put myself in the mindset of someone with an opposite point of view that, well, actually supporting Trump is an act of moral courage, given how unpopular he is among some people. Anyway, and I've been following, as I mentioned briefly to you before we started recording, been following the political trajectory of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. this year, and he recently came out in support of Trump, suspended his own campaign, and he said he did it even at the cost of his tension in his marriage and family relations and friends, because he saw the opportunity to do some good in the area of children's health. So if you wanted to assess his choice of doing that using the kind of model you're using, what would you be looking for in order to determine how he came to this decision and whether it would be categorized as an act of moral courage?
Yeah, well, moral courage is basically action. It has to be action. You can't just think about it. You have to actually take an act that is really designed to do what you feel is right, given your value system. And so that's where you get into the differences, so that you could have someone whose value systems you actually disagree with. But if they're acting in accordance with those, then they can still be judged morally courageous. So one of the differences that you find is that people who are morally courageous in the purest sense tend to accord respect to their opponents. So they don't try to tear down their opponents. They see them as people who should be reasoned with. And so I don't know enough about Robert Kennedy Jr. to know whether or not he does that, but I think he's been a little inconsistent in some of the things that he's said. For example, he'll say, if you give me evidence of something, I will consider it. And so just to take the vaccines, there is a lot of evidence which he has been shown, and he tends to disregard it. So I'm not sure he would fit into the purely morally courageous, because he's not listening to other people. He is acting out of his values and doing what he believes is right, but I'm not sure he's actually considering evidence on the other side. And that's one of the important things to do. If you're morally courageous, you have to listen to the other people and really listen, not just talk at them, which is what we tend to do too much. But yes, certainly he shows many elements of moral courage. There are a lot of different components to it, and some of which he's done, I think, has been morally courageous. I think it's difficult to break with your siblings. He's from a fairly close family. I don't know enough about his marriage to know if he's how his wife feels about things. I haven't focused on him enough, so I can't answer that. But he certainly has taken a lot of criticism from Democrats for what he's done, and I think that's difficult to do too.
You briefly referenced your next project, and I think it had something to do with looking at this differently. I just want to reiterate some of what you were saying about applying your model first, which was that you have kind of a checklist of qualities that you look for in public statements or how people explain their actions. And that checklist is not arbitrary. It came out of your previous research, hearing what people had to say about acts that we could all agree were morally courageous, and these are the things they seem to have in common. So going to further extend this research. What's the direction of the next project? I forget what you said, but it had something to do with, looking beyond
Well,
Okay,
one of the
go ahead.
points you raised a very good point, which is that most people, when they think of moral courage, they talk about people who are doing things that they agree with. So that, I mean, I like the people who stood up to Donald Trump. I like them a lot more after I got into their heads and understood them. But I'm a progressive leftist Democrat, and so a Republican who stands up to Donald Trump is someone I admire. Now, what about moral courage in situations where you don't admire the person? Where Kennedy, the instance that I don't agree with his policies. I think they're crazy in many, many ways. I think the vaccine policy in particular is totally misguided and is ignoring a great deal of scientific evidence that's objective that vaccines do help people. And if we adopted a no-vax policy, we're going to have a lot of serious health issues in this country. So he's not someone I agree with, but he certainly has had moral courage. And so what I'm doing in the next book, I have two books actually. One is looking at people who showed moral courage, whose values I disagree with. So we're looking at Thomas More in England, who was Chancellor of England under Henry VIII. And he was a very devoted Catholic. He did not believe that Henry should be head of the church. And there was an oath that he had to sign as an official saying that Anne Boleyn's children were legitimate and that the children from Catherine of Aragon were not legitimate. She was divorced, and he refused to do it, and he was executed for it. Well, if you look at Thomas More, he was a dreadful anti-Semite. He was a rabid anti what he called heretics, which are Protestants. He had instruments of torture in his own home, so he could torture heretics and get them to, go back to the true faith. This is not someone you admire. The other group I'm looking at is Martin Luther, who was also similar in his values. And then the last group of people I'm looking at are people from the Third Reich who said that they opposed Hitler, that they actually broke with him and were trying to delay things. So that Wilhelm Stuckart, who is the person who co-wrote the Nuremberg laws and was one of the people who was at the Wannsee conference when they came up with the final solution, was a jurist, and he insisted that what he did was to try to delay things. And the court agreed with him. They let him off with time served before he was tried and a fine. And so is that morally courageous? They accepted what he did as morally courageous, and we're analyzing him to see whether or not he falls into the category. So that's one of the things we're doing. Another book I'm working on is a book of people who fled the Third Reich, who were Jewish emigres. And came to this country, and they show us a great deal about what immigrants are like, what refugees are like. I mean, all of these people were extraordinary human beings. They had great courses. One of my favorite, if you think about how stupid the Holocaust was, is a man named George Bersey, who just died about a month ago in his hundreds. And he was not allowed to be a doctor because he was Jewish. So he became an engineer. And then after the war, he went back to Hungary. He was on his way to Auschwitz, and the Allies bombed the train station in Vienna, and the guards fled. And so he escaped. And then he went out and developed laparoscopic surgery and made a great contribution. And so you listen to what these people say, and it's like, it shows you how foolish the whole kind of prejudice thing is that we have. Why do we really care about what religion people have? Why is that something that we will kill people over, as they're doing all over the world still in the Middle East? Why do we care about ethnic differences? Why do we care about why people, what they do in their privacy of their own homes, who they love? So you look at some of these issues about prejudice, and which are some of the issues that Trump is tapping into. And you think about it from an objective point of view, it doesn't make any sense at all. But all of these things are created, I call it moral salience, why do we care about the skin color? I mean, you and I have light skin. I have so many basal cells I've had dug out of my face. I wish I had more pigment. But we discriminate against people on the basis of that. I mean, you look at Kamala Harris, and I think she's been extraordinarily disciplined and wise not to play up that you should vote for me just because I'm African American. Vote for her for a whole many other reasons. And I think that's, she's trying to move us away from the kind of identity politics, which I think have hurt the Democratic Party a little bit. So that's one of the things I learned from the book, listening to Scaramucci in particular, that you have to understand and try to put yourself in the mind of a Trump supporter. Why is it that they find him attractive? And people are scared of people who are different, instead of viewing them as someone who can bring more interesting food into your life or more interesting cultural customs, or just knowledge of their country and how they operate. We tend to view them as people who can hurt us, who are threatening. And Trump has exacerbated that. And I think that's not something we should be focusing on in this country.
A couple of random thoughts in response to what you're saying. One, there was a movie several years ago about Thomas More that presented him in a very heroic light, but it was a good movie because it did highlight his moral choice in the face of being executed by the king.
Man for all seasons, yeah.
Yeah. And I was also thinking about how you can find examples of this in any political direction, because I'm thinking now, you mentioned the Middle East, a lot of Democrats are disagreeing with the party and facing a lot of, well, on both sides, a lot of pushback and a lot of whatever side you're on. There's other people who are willing to be very vehement that you're wrong and you're dangerous and your thoughts are dangerous. So there are people of a variety of political persuasions who have dissenters within their midst, and it takes a lot of courage to stand up to the dominant consensus. It can lead to ostracism at best and maybe physical violence at worst.
Right. And we see this now in the Middle East in terms of what's happening and on campuses.
Yeah.
So I've been very concerned about what's going on campuses. Again, it goes back to my basic theory that you have to understand how you see yourself in relation to other people. So that we had a mess on my campus. They called in the police. There were police from 25 different cities that came with riot gear and guns. And the chancellor, who's someone I'm good friend, he's in my department, and I just totally disagreed with how he handled it. I think he overreacted. And I think what happened is if you view these people, and that's the first phrase that you do, it's a distancing, so that they are different, they're not part of us, as opposed to students who are part of your community that you want to engage with. I mean, what is it that you want in a good student? You want someone who's bright, you want someone who cares about good values and is willing to operate on the basis of those. And these are precisely the kind of kids we should have gone out and been talking with. And they did do that some places. So at Northwestern University, the provost went out and said, what is it you want? And I think they gave them some money to set up some things, studying anti-Semitism, studying Islamophobia at Berkeley, which is usually a hotbed of political activity. The chancellor there did a wonderful job, a woman named Carol Christ. And she actually said a wonderful statement from her that one of the things we don't do well in this country is understanding how to have dialogue with people who feel passionately about political views and their opinions differ strongly from ours. And that is the role the university should be playing. So this is one of the failures of a lot of universities, is that they're not viewing these kids as people who are part of our community, who should be spoken with and cherished, and set up a dialogue with them, know that they're valued, even though you may differ strongly with them, but that you can accord them respect. And I'm very concerned about what's going to happen this fall on campuses, because a lot of campuses during the summer have changed their rules rather draconianly, so that they have a new chancellor at Berkeley. I'm nervous about this because he says free speech is fine, but if you're going to engage in civil disobedience, you have to take the consequences. And so they're making that distinction, and then they're going to punish the people who are engaged in what I think is legitimate dialogue on a university campus. We had an incident on my campus 20 years ago or so now, where the Israeli ambassador was not allowed to speak. The Muslim students scattered themselves throughout the audience. Whenever he'd speak, someone would stand up and make a statement. And then they'd be ushered out by the police, and then someone else would do it. And I did not realize that at the time I was teaching a course called The Politics of Difference, which is how you deal with differences, whether it be age, race, ethnicity, religion, whatever, how you deal with it. And we started out and we talked about age as the first discriminator, which is an easy one. And then we did a lot of social psychology work on it. The head of the Muslim Student Union was in my class. We had no problems at all. He engaged in conversations when we talked about anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia. And so if you build up trust between people, if you accord them respect as members of a common community, then you're not going to have some of these problems that I think we're going to see on campus this fall. And it does concern me because I'm old enough like you are. I remember Kent State, that horrible picture of that young woman over a body. And there were a lot of campuses where they called out the National Guard. And I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, and the faculty view was, yeah, of course the war is wrong. Let's just get on with our lives so you can go ahead and do something about it in a creative way. And nobody had any problems with anything. We didn't have any riots on campus. So I think how you treat other people is very important from an ethical point of view, but also from a practical politics point of view. You don't have the same problems if you accord people respect. And that's one of the things that is troubling about Trump, because he doesn't do that. He doesn't see us all as members of the same group. He sees you're either against him or you're for him. That's it. And that's not something that works well in political life.
I've long thought that the basis of morality is this capacity to empathize with other people, and that the project of trying to root ethics in a purely rational framework is not going to work, because there's no reason to believe other people are just like you. There's lots of reasons to think we're different, and I think it's a very human thing to separate people into friends and enemies. So it has to be cultivated, and I think that's where universities are in a flashpoint right now, because the emphasis has always been on, okay, reason, facts, all that, but then values, okay, that's something that we can't take a stand on because there's no agreement. But it's been implicit in the founding of universities that we're trying to understand each other, understand humanity writ large. But that's my soapbox. So
Well,
I agree with you.
I'm up there. One of the students in my, I guess it was 4 or 5 years ago, some students said it referred to a free speech zone. I said, what is a free speech zone? They said, it's a place on campus where you can say whatever you want. And I said, you can do that everywhere. You don't have to have designated zones for free speech zones. This is ridiculous. And I think this is somewhere where the left has kind of gone a little crazy too. Where the idea that I'm having students now who are afraid of saying what they think because they're afraid they're going to be canceled. And you can't do that either. And that's also something that's going on that I think has been unfortunate, that people, we mentioned earlier that with the Trump, where I went back to my home and I see these women that I grew up with, and I call them the girls. And someone on the left really lit into me and said, they're women. And I said, of course they're women, but the thing that's important about them to me is that they remember me when I was a girl. And those people, I'm old enough now that I like people who know me when I was young. So we shouldn't be criticizing people. I mean, do you really care that much about the pronouns that you use? I mean, if someone is wanting to transition, that's fine. Let them tell you and do it. Try to respect them. But I don't think we should get mad at people because they don't use the right pronoun, or they screw up on some minor way. I think that's just, you have to look at more important things in life than that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kristen Monroe, for your time and speaking to me and the viewers. Again, the book that she's recently published with her student co-author researchers is Politics, Principle, and Standing Up to Donald Trump, Moral Courage in the Republican Party. Any final words before we go?
We need to have moral courage in the Republican Party, and I'm hoping that people like George Bush will come out and do the right thing and say what he thinks publicly, which I think is that Trump is not someone who represents the best of the Republican values. We need to have a strong two-party system in this country, and Trump is turning it into a party where loyalty to him is more crucial than values or policies, and that's not something that's going to go well in the long run.
Well, that may be one of the flaws of a two-party system, is that it forces people into one or the other position.
That's true.
Where there could be a variety of views. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I'll get this out sometime mid next week and let you know when it's up.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.